Welcome to lecture number 2, the Islamic Caliphate and Jewish-Muslim relations. It is impossible to discuss the Middle East today without the context, the historical context given to it by the emergence of Islam and by Islamic rule for centuries. So this is why our story begins with the emergence of Islam. Please look at this map of the Mashriq. This is the Near East before Islam. In the few centuries before the rise of Islam, this region was dominated mainly by two rival states or empires. On the one hand, the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, which was the old Roman Empire, or to be precise, what was left of it. And on the other hand, across its eastern border, in the eastern half of the Fertile Crescent and in the lands beyond, lay the empire of the Sasanians, which was an Iranian dynasty which had came to power in the 3rd century. These two empires were bitter rivals, and for much of late antiquity they were at war. Their political rivalry, however, did not completely preclude meaningful cultural contact across these two empires. What you can also see in this map is the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and in the Arabian Peninsula, please pay attention to the cities of Mecca and Yathrib. We'll come back to this in a moment. Here again we have another version of the same map that we just looked at in the previous slide. Here we can also see that there were some Arab tribes and communities, some of them bound to the Byzantine Empire and others to the Persian Empire. Now, if we look further south across the Red Sea, we can also here identify two important kingdoms that existed at that time. One was the ancient kingdom of Aksum in today's Ethiopia, which in the 4th century adopted Christianity. The other kingdom on the Arabian Peninsula was that of the Emirate in the Yemen of today, which for some time adopted Judaism as its official religion. Now, our story focuses now on the region between the great empires, the Byzantine and the Sassanid empires of the north, and the kingdoms of the Red Sea on the south, on the Arabian Peninsula itself, and more precisely on the region that is called the Hejaz in the Arabian Peninsula, which is here in green on the map on the right. The inhabitants of the Hejaz spoke various dialects of Arabic. They live in small cities around oases, and some of them were nomads or Bedouins. By mid-7th century, a new political order was created in the region, which eventually will swallow the whole of the Arabian Peninsula in terms of their political regimes that we just mentioned, but also the whole of the Sasanian Empire and the Syrian and Egyptian provinces of the Byzantine Empire. Within the Hejaz region, we focus now on the city of Mecca. The city of Mecca was characterized by social injustice. From a religious point of view, it was paganism and polytheism, and also slavery. The city of Mecca was controlled politically by the clan of the Quraysh, which also dominated the most sacred place, as it was considered back then, the Kaaba, but which is also located at today's Islam's most sacred mosque, Al-Masjid al-Haram. The Quraysh demanded money for people to go into the Kaaba and be able to profess their religion, though there were a variety of religions, as we said, polytheism, and they also believe in all sorts of gods. It was in this region, as we said before, that a new political and cultural regime will emerge. This new order was created by Arab people from the Hejaz under the leadership of Muhammad. Muhammad was a citizen of Mecca, and he was born in the year of 569. In the area where Muhammad was born, and all across the Hejaz area, lived together also some Jewish and Christian tribes, together with the polytheist Arabs. So as we said, in the town or city of Mecca, Muhammad was born. Little is known about Muhammad's early life, and the accounts that exist were written about 100 years after his death. Muhammad lost his both parents in his childhood, and we know that he was raised by his uncle, Abu Talib. By his 20s, he became a successful trader, and though he achieved economic success, the narrative about his life says that he had trouble to accept the realities of social injustice and poverty in Mecca. He was known in the city for his generosity and good judgment, and he questioned the tribal religions that worshipped multiple gods. So in other words, he criticized paganism and polytheism, and this was in a context that the idea of a single monotheistic God was gaining popularity. We need to remember that he lived very close to Jewish and Christian tribes, which profess monotheism. Muhammad used to go on retreats from his work, and he used to do that in a cave outside Mecca. At the age of 40, Muhammad had a vision that would change the course of history. That happened in year 609. According to Muslim tradition, in that cave, it was revealed to Muhammad that he was the messenger of God, and the word of God was revealed to him. This was quite a transformation for Muhammad, and he first talked and to some extent preached the word of God that was revealed to him in his retreats in the cave, just to his family and friends. But 3 years later, Muhammad started preaching and telling the word of God, the revelations, more publicly. This was a huge transformation, not just for Muhammad, but slowly also for the people of Mecca. Few years before, as we said, Muhammad was just a successful businessman. And all of a sudden, he began becoming what in the biblical tradition is known as a prophet. The revelations in the cave marked the beginning of 22 years of further revelations until Muhammad's death. During time, Muhammad began gathering a small group of followers who became known as Muslims, which means those who submit to God. Muslims, the root of the word in Arabic, is related to the word Islam. Both have the same linguistic root. Muhammad made clear that the revelations are the same revelations that were sent down to the Jews and the Christians, only that this time the revelations were sent to the Arab people. A message about God's guidance to humankind. And we need to remember that the audience that eventually what will be called the Quran is revealed to was already familiar with the biblical stories from the Old and the New Testament. The stories and the verses revealed to Muhammad are told to the public by Muhammad in recitation. Muhammad didn't know reading, neither writing, so he was illiterate. And in spite of that, he managed to recite in perfect Arabic all those revelations that were given to him. The word Quran itself means recitation, the recitation, el Quran. So, for Muhammad and later for his followers, there was a great deal of using memory to keep alive the verses coming from the revelations. So, at the very beginning, this new faith that was being formed, that will be called Islam, was an oral culture, much as the other existing religions. Now, in terms of the contents of these verses, these messages that were coming from the revelations, these appealed especially to the poor and the underprivileged. This is because these verses that Muhammad was reciting to the people, were about social justice. He said also that slaves should be freed. The rich and the powerful should give charity to the needy, and so on and so forth. According to Muslim tradition, the times before Islam are seen as the days of ignorance, or the Jahiliyyah. It will not surprise you if I tell you that Muhammad's new messages to the people of Mecca and the surrounding stir strong opposition. In fact, Muhammad's arguments against paganism, polytheism, and against social injustice infuriated mainly the Quraysh tribe, who controlled the city and the Kaaba, and therefore also the tributes paid to them by the people. So Muhammad was threatening their power, which meant that A new conflict was emerging not just on the religious dimension, but also economic and political dimensions as well. This is why the Quraysh and the Meccans who supported the Quraysh began persecuting Muhammad and his followers, the Muslims. When Muhammad's powerful uncle and wife who protected him died, Muhammad eventually will need to leave Mecca. In year 622, a plot to assassinate Muhammad is discovered, and Muhammad and his followers had no other choice but to leave the city. They moved to Yathrib on the north, 250 miles from Mecca, and this migration of the Muslims is known in the Islamic tradition as the Hijrah. Yathrib, the city where Muhammad and his followers moved to, will be later called Medina or Medinat al-Nabi, which means the city of the Prophet. In Yathrib or Medina, Muhammad becomes a leader. And to become a leader, Muhammad entered into a public dialogue with the people of Medina and the different tribes, which eventually resulted in a written charter of rights and obligations that came to be known as the Covenant of Medina or the Constitution of Medina. This document, in fact, institutionalized the Islamic city-state. The document established the concept of a ruler who is accountable to an established code, and it also provided the basis for the emergence of the Muslim community as a separated political entity, and for the development of the concept of the Islamic welfare state. At some point, the Jewish tribes in Yathrib or Medina entered the covenant, as well as other groups fleeing from other regions. In fact, the covenant established the foundations of a multi-religious Islamic society. During his life in Medina, Islamic law was legislated. It ruled on all aspects of life, or almost all aspects of life, from prohibiting alcohol, allowing mothers to nurse for up to 2 years, laws of inheritance, rights to the dispossessed, and new rules elevating the status of women. But as I said, not all aspects of life were fully interpreted, as for instance the question of polygamy, which obviously affected women. At some point, all of Medina converted to Islam, and its law became the law of the city. Muhammad became the chief whose decisions were to be obeyed. The fact that an illiterate man in the middle of the desert suddenly produces these perfect, powerful verses, this was the explanations that Muslims gave when asked for proof that the verses were the word of God. Muhammad also was interested in receiving reparations from Mecca for the losses suffered by the Meccan Muslims who had to flee the city. Mecca and the Quraysh refused, and the Muslims from Medina and the area fought the Meccans for 8 years, all across the Arabian Peninsula. In the year 630, the Muslims launched a vast attack and defeated Mecca. Muhammad declared amnesty to everyone in the city. He died in the year of 632, leaving a legacy of his personality, a new religion, eventually the verses organized in the form of what became to be known as the Quran, and a new form of political organization. From this moment, among the Muslims, Muhammad was considered the seal or the final prophet in the tradition established by Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. When Muhammad died, Muslims ruled over the Arabian Peninsula, but Muhammad's successors continued to expand this new kingdom, this new political Muslim regime. And as you can see in this map, it became an empire, a very extended caliphate that by mid-8th century, it reached not only the whole of the territories of the Sasanian and the Byzantine Empire in the Mashriq, but also North Africa, that is the Maghreb, and also Spain, and for some years, even the southern part of France. It is really important to note that the Muslims spread by imposing military superiority, but their rulers, most of the time, prefer to absorb and accommodate the people who they conquer, enable for a regime that was able to tolerate cultural diversity. Muhammad's successors were not considered neither called prophets, but caliph. Caliph is a political leader with some religious authority. The Muslim community of believers is called the Ummah, or the nation of believers. Muhammad's first successor, the first four, which are considered the rightly guided or the Rashidun because they were closest to Muhammad's life, were Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's father-in-law and his closest companion and advisor, and then Umar, Uthman, and Ali. The Islamic caliphates evolved as dynasties. The two most important dynasties were the Umayyad and the Abbasid that ruled for some time simultaneously in different parts of the empire and had their centers of operation of the kingdom, the Umayyad in Damascus and later in Cordoba, Spain, and the Abbasid dynasty first in Baghdad and later in Cairo. Another Muslim caliphate or empire will emerge from late 13th century until World War I. This is the Ottoman Empire. Importantly, as we will discuss next week, the Ottomans were not Arabs, but they were Muslim. The most important point, I believe, to note when we look at all these times that the Islamic Caliphate ruled is that this Arab Caliphate managed to unify the region, what we call today the Middle East, as something distinct, because they created a dominant religious and cultural Islamic identity, and also spread the use of Arabic. When you ask yourself why people in North Africa and in many parts of the Mashriq region speak Arabic, where during Muhammad times they weren't speaking Arabic. So the answer is because of the spread of the Islamic caliphates. Under Islamic rule during the times of the Islamic Caliphate, religious coercion was forbidden. In fact, it is forbidden by the Quran. It means that Muslims should not be trying, in a missionary way to coerce and bring others into the fold of Islam. Jews and Christians were considered the people of the book, Hal al-Kitab, and therefore were given a special status called dhimmi, though there were other religious minorities that also were awarded this status of dhimmi, which basically means protected person. It meant that the state will protect these religious minorities. These communities were able to practice their religion, were exempted from certain duties such as the army, and couldn't enjoy certain political rights. They had to pay a tax called jizya. They could work in any profession and were equal under the laws of property, contract, and obligation. What we are going to discuss in the next slide is how this status of dhimmi influenced the relations that evolved between Muslims and Jews.
One of the least known stories in the history of Western Christianity is that of Muslim Spain, seen here in a map of Spain in 1037, the extent of which reaching up to the very north of the peninsula, with Leon and Castile, the Christian lands of Navarre, Aragon, and Barcelona, with the major part of the Iberian Peninsula dominated by Muslim rule. It was a time.
Let us expand a bit more about the Jews from Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus, as it was commonly known, the region under Islamic rule. We are focusing mainly between the 10th and the 12th centuries. This period of time is known as the Golden Age of Andalusian Jews. And this is because, in spite of the fact that there was some level of violence between the communities, as it happened in all medieval societies, violence was not what characterized the relations between the Jewish community and the Muslims in Spain and Portugal. No other medieval Jewish community had so many high-ranking personalities in the political and economic spheres under Islamic rule in the peninsula. Nowhere else they had such economic prosperity. No other Jewish community at that time produced a literary culture of such breadth, expressing an intellectual life shared with the Muslims. In fact, the Jews from Al-Andalus adopted the Arabic language as their main language, and also many Arab cultural traditions. So in other words, what took place was a becoming Arab of Jewish life, an Arabization of Jewish life. Similar trends, though not at that intensity and glory as in the Iberian Peninsula, took place as well between Jews and Muslims in other regions of the Islamic Caliphate, both in the Mashriq as well as in the Maghreb. We also call the Jews from Al-Andalus, the Jews from Muslim Spain, Sephardim. It is a word in Hebrew. Sepharad means Spain. So by Sephardim or Sepharadic, we mean the Jews from Spain. What is very important to note is that as these form of cultural interaction and cultural production took place for the Jewish communities under Islamic rule, no such prosperity and tolerance was experienced by the Jews living in other European societies where they suffer from violence, and also they were not allowed to practice their religion many times during this period across a number of regions in Europe, as well as they were forbidden for work in a number of professions. There are two very important conclusions to stress up to this point. I just mentioned one, that during medieval and modern times, we will see as well, and in fact up to mid-20th century, Jewish communities from Arab and Muslim lands fared much better than Jewish communities from European lands. The second point is to note that the Arabs and Jews have not been rivals since times immemorial, as people tend to think. And if people think that way, it's because the ways that we tend to speak about the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So as we see now through this brief overview of history during Islamic rule in Spain and in the Middle East, we learn that Arabs and Jews have not been at war since times immemorial. This is a very important point to keep in mind when we will, in few weeks, move deeper into the Israel-Palestine conflict itself. Before we move ahead with the topic of this week, I would like to spend a few moments in some definitions, because we are talking about Jewish people in Spain, in Europe, in North Africa, different parts of the world, and this needs to be explained to some extent at least. So according to the story of the Old Testament, the Hebrew people or the Israelites emerged in what is called the land of Israel or Palestine, as Palestinians defined it. And that happened around the second millennium before the Common Era. Now, the Hebrew people experienced many dispersions and exiles because of different imperial occupations, and they established communities in different parts of the world. This is how we found Jews in Spain when the Arabs conquered Spain and established an Islamic caliphate. Now, only in exile at some point in time, the Hebrew people are started to be called Jewish people, which is derived from the word Judea in the land of Israel / Palestine. There are many Jewish communities, and this list here does not exhaust all of them, but on the other hand, these are the three groups that we generally identified in contemporary times. So we are talking about the Oriental or Arab Jews, the European Ashkenazi Jews, and the Ethiopian Jews. So let's expand a bit about these three categories. So who are the Oriental or the Arab Jews? And I reckon you noted that we started in a way to talk about them when we refer to the Jews from Spain. So the Oriental or Arab Jews are Jewish communities that they evolved within Muslim and or Arab lands and have been Arabized during the time. These Oriental or Arab Jewish community include, as we already know, the Sephardic Jews of Iberian descent from Spain and Portugal. We haven't said yet that these Jewish communities were expelled from Spain and Portugal, from Spain in 1492, the same year that the last Muslim caliphate fell after the Battle of Granada. And many of these Sephardic Jews were absorbed within the provinces of the Ottoman Empire because they were invited by the Sultan Bayezid Ibelli. Now, when these Jewish communities from Spain escaped Spain and later Portugal, they also immigrated to North Africa, where there were already Jewish communities from the Roman times, and also some of the Sephardic Jews eventually ended up in Holland and Italy. So these are the Sephardic Jews, part of the Oriental or Arab Jews. We also have the Maghreb Jews or North African Jews. These are communities for different period of time, some of them very ancient communities from Roman times, others communities that were formed after the expulsion of the Sephardic Jews from Spain. And then we have what we formally call the Mizrahi Jews or the Mizrahim. By the way, when you see the I am at the end of the word Maghrebim or Mizrahim, this is the plural in Hebrew for the word. So the singular will be Mizrahi, the plural will be Mizrahim, the same with Maghrebi and Maghrebim. Now, Mizrahim in Hebrew means Eastern or Oriental, and here we refer to the Jewish community in particularly in the Mashriq and beyond, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, India, Yemen, and Central Asia, including Afghanistan and the Bukhari Jews. So we have the Sephardic Jews, the Maghrebim, and the Mizrahim. These three broad categories form the Oriental or Arab Jews, only that today in contemporary parlance, we refer to these three groups by just one word, and that word is Mizrahim. And that's because, among other reasons, Mizrahim, meaning Oriental or Eastern, captures these three groups in the sense that these are Jewish communities that were influenced during time by they living within Arab and Muslim culture and spaces. The second group is the Ashkenazi Jews, or the Jews from Europe. These are Jewish communities that at some point in time arrived at different European provinces of the Roman Empire and lived there for centuries and coalesced as European communities, European societies. We also call the Ashkenazi Jews the white Jews from a racial point of view. And it is important also to note, as we will see, that the Ashkenazim, again, plural for Ashkenazi, constituted the main population in the immigration of the Jew to Palestine from late 19th century, where our story about the Israel-Palestine conflict began. But we need to wait a couple of weeks for that. Now, the third group is the Ethiopian Jews. These are Jews that have been disconnected from most other Jewish communities for more than 2,000 years. These are communities that evolved in what is today Ethiopia and Eritrea, and only in late 20th century these communities began to emigrate to Israel after its establishment in 1948. So we so that we have the Oriental or the Arab Jews formed by the Sephardim, the Maghrebim, and the Mizrahim, but today Many people call these three groups together as the Mizrahi Jews, the Oriental or Eastern Jews, and then we have the Ashkenazi Jews and the Ethiopian Jews. Now, you may ask why we need all these classifications. One reason is that we need these classifications to understand the colonial encounter that we are going to discuss in a couple of weeks in relation to the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and also in order to understand the different ethnic division within the state of Israel today, which have a great significance in order to understand a variety of social aspects in contemporary Israel. And this is why we need to understand, to have these classifications in place. We are going to complement our conversation about the history of the Islamic Caliphate with a few commentaries on the Quran, Al-Quran book itself. And as I mentioned before, Al-Quran means the recitation. And remember what we discussed about the way the Prophet Muhammad used to communicate the revelations that he experienced in the caves, the word of God. He used to do that in a perfect Arabic in form of a recitation. And this is why all these revelations were put together in a book that it is called the recitation. The Quran is a book about how to live one's life. So as we said, the belief is that Muhammad heard the voice of God who told him, recite. So the Quran was revealed by God directly to the Prophet, or we may say that in the revelation of what God transmitted to him, he became eventually a prophet. Now, it is not just what God inspired the prophet to say, it is in fact God's own message to the world, according to Muslim tradition. So as we also said, again, in Arabic, Quran translate as the recitation, and this is why the scripture is meant to be spoken aloud, to recite it. In so doing, Muslims believe they are communicating directly with God. And this is also why the book itself, the words of the book, have an intrinsic sanctity. Because, again, these are the words of God, part of God. Now, there are many similarities between the Quran and the Jewish and Christian scriptures. All of them speak of one all-powerful God, and they all tell a number of very similar stories. But in contrast to the Old and the New Testaments, the Quran is different also in its layout. Unlike the Bible, the Quran follows no chronology or central or linear narrative. Instead, it consists of 114 chapters, in Arabic, surahs, and they are divided into 6,000 verses, or ayat. Now, in these verses, the Quran doesn't tell the history of Muhammad. The Quran is not about the history of Muhammad. It doesn't tell the history of the world in the way it's told in the Bible. So you see here, again, further dissimilarities with the New and Old Testament. For Muslims, the Quran is not a story but a message, an ethical message about the right path in life. It is about, if we like, how we define our morality. In Islam, there is no governing religious body, as for instance, in Christianity, we have the Vatican. So we have different and even oppositional interpretation of the Quran itself. It cannot be interpreted just in one official institutional way. Now, how the Quran became to be a compiled text? As Islam was spreading outside the Arabian Peninsula, when the Islamic Caliphate was expanding, the verses that were coming from Muhammad's recitations were being obviously altered. So the idea of writing down these verses became a necessity. It was the third Caliph, Uthman, who organized a committee to compile all the verses from the recitations. And this was very hard work because there was a need to compare a number of versions that were already going on at that time in different regions. And this was for the sake of deciding which version was the closest to the original one. That work of comparison and compilation took 20 years. Now, one more word about comparing with Christian and Jewish traditions and scriptures. Muslims believe that the Quran rectifies the mistakes and distortions in the Jewish and the Christian scriptures. In other words, the Jewish and Christian scriptures do not fully recite the full, complete Word of God. So, because of this distortion, it was necessary for God to reveal His Word one more time. And here is where Muhammad and his role come into this story. So, in Muslim tradition, therefore, the Quran is the final, the complete, uncorrupted revelation to humanity. As you can see, we are not going too deep into these topics because in reality, to understand as we should Islam from a religious point of view, as well as the history of Islam and the political regimes that Islam created, we obviously need not just few subjects, but perhaps a whole degree. Nevertheless, we are trying to provide here some basic understanding with which we are able to better understand and create a context, a proper context for the kind of analysis that we want to pursue in next weeks when we come to discuss the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, some basic tenets in Islam, some of which you already know. For instance, the fact that according to Islamic tradition, Islam continues and corrects Judaism and Christianity. We know that Muhammad is the messenger of God. We also said that Islam believes in the other holy books. We need to add that in Islam, there is a belief in the indivisibility of God's unity and divinity. Islam believes in the whole spectrum of the prophets of God, of the monotheistic God of the peoples of the book, from Adam to Muhammad himself. It believes in the day of judgment. Muslims who practice their religion pray 5 times a day. There is a high regards to the value of give to charity, which is related to the idea of social justice. And also there is an expectation that a good religious Muslim will fulfill a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. Though the Quran is the most sacred text in Islam, it is not the only text. We have also the Hadith, which is a compilation of selected narratives and interpretation of the Prophet's actions. As you remember, we said that the Quran is not the story of Muhammad's life. So in the Hadith, we find that kind of writing trying to interpret the Prophet's actions. And this was collected by letter compilers in the 8th and 9th centuries. We have also the Tafsir, which is a more systematic, we would say, scientific Quranic commentary, written even later in the 10th century. And also we have the Sharia, which is the legal code of Islam. And these codes derive from interpretations from the Quran, the Hadith, and also from tradition. The concept of jihad is one of the most contested in Islamic political discourse, but not because of Muslims themselves, but because of how Western societies and regimes interpret or prefer to interpret the concept of jihad. The narrow interpretation, the one that is preferred by the West, is holy war. But in reality, to make references to war, the Quran uses another word, which is qital, not jihad. Now, the more literal and orthodox meaning of jihad is self-exertion. The word itself, jihad, is mentioned just 32 times in the Quran, and it emphasizes different perspectives of a process of self-realization on the path to God. So, in fact, we can say that those who believe in God are in a perpetual state of jihad. So we have the meaning according to which jihad is a struggle against temptation and to live as a virtuous Muslim. This is the jihad of the heart. There is the second meaning, which means to spread the word of Islam, jihad of the tongue. Then there is the interpretation in relation to social responsibility and social justice, the jihad of the hand. And fourthly, jihad in relation to the defense of the Muslim community under threat, jihad of the sword. And again, remember that to refer to war itself, the Quran uses the idea of qital. So this is the more complex understandings of the idea of jihad. The major division within Islam is the Sunni-Shia divide. The Muslim worldwide community is 1.6 billion people, of which 85% are Sunni. Now, this division began over a contest of who should succeed Muhammad after he died. The group that was called the Sunni, or Sunnah, meaning the way, emerged from those who favored qualified candidates to become caliph, while on the other hand, the Shia, or the partisans of Ali, Shiatu Ali, and from Shia to the word Shia, this group favor authority to be passed to Ali, who was the Prophet's son-in-law. Now, this division has many dimensions. There are doctrinal differences, such as in the way people pray, in the interpretation of the Sharia law, and also in the way people interpret political authority. But in addition to all these, today two countries compete for the leadership of Islam. On the one hand, Sunni Saudi Arabia, and on the other hand, Shia Iran. This rivalry has influenced many conflicts in the Middle East, including in Syria, Lebanon, Bahrain, Iraq, and Yemen. Now, it is important to understand that for centuries, Sunni and Shia communities have lived in peace. Now, to complete this commentary about Sunni and Shia Islam, we are now going to watch a brief documentary about this topic.
If we want to understand the Middle East, if we want to understand why conflicts are happening the way they are and how these conflicts may be resolved, we cannot take our eyes off of the Shia-Sunni conflict. Whether it's the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or the Syria war, or the escalating civil war in Iran, they all involve sectarianism between Shias and Sunnis.
The Shia-Sunni divide is a political and religious divide around who was the rightful heir after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad in early Islam. Yes, it's remote history going back to the 7th century, but for millions of Muslims around the world, it's what defines them, sectarianism.
بأن الجريمة التي ارتكبت بحق الحسين لم تنتهي وإنما لا زالت فصولها التي نعيشها اليوم من الإرهابيين والطائفيين والحاقدين على الإسلام وأهل البيت.
Now, it is not as if you could say, well, let's just resolve this original dispute over the succession and we can be one. There is now 1400 years of different political, social, cultural, and theological history that separates them.
Of the approximately 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, about 85% are Sunni and 15% are Shia. This is a conflict of identity far more than it is a conflict of belief and practice. People actually do feel this divide deeply, emotionally. We are seeing a catastrophic civil war in Syria between the Sunni and the Shia, an ongoing conflict in Lebanon between the majority Shia population and the Sunni leadership, and in Iraq over the last decade, a devastating battle between the Sunni minority and the Shia majority. We've seen it in Iran with a small Sunni population in the south, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, in which puritanical movements within Sunni Islam have slaughtered thousands of Shia. In Bahrain, the very large oppressed Shia majority has risen up against the Sunni leadership of that country.
This conflict stares America in the face. It does have an effect on US foreign policy and US interests in the region. Whether it's in Syria, where we've seen tens of thousands of people being killed and millions displaced, or Pakistan, where the US is concerned about what happens when it withdraws from Afghanistan, or Bahrain, where the US Fifth Fleet is based, Saudi Arabia, which is home to oil reserves, whether it's in Iraq, where the US has lost lives and billions of dollars in treasure.
There are dangers of fierce sectarian fighting if, for example, these terrorist organizations try to overrun sacred Shia sites, which could trigger Shia-Sunni conflicts that could be very hard to stamp out. So we have enormous interest there.
My greatest fear is that something could conflate that leads to an all-out sectarian regional war. God forbid that it should happen, but the ingredients for that happening are very much alive.
For most of Islamic history, Shiites and Sunnis have lived quietly side by side, not necessarily happily, but quietly. Pogroms and outright conflict have been rare in history, and they happen when there is a political prize to fight over. The most important primary event that brought the Shia-Sunni conflict into the fore was the Iranian Revolution. Once the Shiites asserted their preeminence in carrying out an Islamic revolution in Islamic politics, there was immediately Sunni backlash.
Fast forward to 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell, for the first time in that capital, you have a Shiite-dominated government, which didn't go unnoticed in the Gulf, and certainly not in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh. And as chaos spread through Iraq, you could only depend on your own community and your affiliation with that community to keep you alive. And that's when you really saw the Sunni-Shia divide become personal. It was no longer political, but it was neighborhood to neighborhood and neighbor to neighbor.
The Arab uprisings have also been a factor that's reignited the conflict. This is why you see a civil war in Syria that has a strong sectarian dimension. In many countries, what started as a political rivalry evolved into also a religious conflict.
It's not that the Shias and Sunnis were not there in history before. It was that sectarianism was contained by the structure of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. The structure that was containing them cracked. So that actually caused the fight that was simmering below this edifice of calm in the region to erupt.
أدعو المسلمين أن يذهبوا لينصروا إخوتهم في سوريا. لا يمكن أن ندع إخوتنا يقتلون ونحن نتفرج، حرام علينا.
وإذا احتاجت المعركة مع هؤلاء الإرهابيين التكفيريين أن أذهب أنا وكل حزب الله إلى سوريا، سنذهب إلى سوريا.
Whether it's Shia or Sunni, the motivation is all the same. What they all have in common is the embrace of theological justifications to legitimize the violence that they perpetrate, that transforms the motivations to commit this violence to something much more personal. For all these groups to survive and for all of them to engage in terrorism, they need some outside patron, whether it's wealthy individuals or whether it's a state backer.
Both Iran and Saudi Arabia have been responsible for escalating this Sunni-Shia divide. And they are doing it for their own geopolitical interests. It's not just a perception that these two countries are trying to control different parts of the Middle East. It's a reality. It's in the form of funding, it's in the form of arms, it's in the form, in some cases, of even soldiers inside these countries.
There are no bright spots in the region. Sectarianism will mean instability in the region for some period. It'd be difficult for states to rule over their populations happily. You're going to end up with challenges to authority, civil wars, violence, bombings, etc. That would keep the region from focusing on economic growth, focusing on political stability. What we can do is to encourage the major regional powers to deal with their differences. And we have to help Middle East states cross this transition from authoritarianism to veritable democracy.
You can't say to a minority, whether it be a Sunni or a Shiite, democracy will be great for you because what people hear is majority rules. That's not democracy. And until there's a system that protects different sectarian expressions of religion, there's not an answer in the region to the Sunni-Shia divide.
you.